Chapter 52. Why law? A relevant question which must be confronted is, why law? Why should there be any law whatsoever? This question was raised by, among others, Ted Bundy, the serial killer of a number of young women. He had confessed to killing 2 or 3 dozen women, and some believed him to be guilty of the rape and murder of 50 or 100. Before his execution in January 1989, quote, he rambled on once about hunters who stalked and killed deer and were never plagued by a guilty conscience. Why are we so moralistic, Bundy wanted to know, when it comes to human life? Why is a human life worth more than a deer's life? End quote. This is a logical question if you do not believe in the Christian God, nor that man is made in his image. Certainly the Marquis de Sade denied that any crime existed except Christianity because he denied its God and law. Long before that, however, others had denied the validity of any law of eternal validity, binding on all men always. The Greek gods were above the law, and great men began to share that, quote, divine privilege, end quote. Socrates and Plato clearly held that view, and Plato's Republic had no laws, only philosopher-kings. The philosopher-kings controlled and regulated all others, but were themselves subject to none. The result of such thinking was the rise of tyrants. Only late in life did Plato write his study of law and allow, for an interim at least, the use of law. Like thinking prevailed in Rome. The emperors were gods in the making, and they were therefore above the dictates of law and morality. Caligula and others took this very seriously, as Suetonius reports in the Lives of the First 12 Caesars. Because law was for mere mortals, gods in the making felt free to break every kind of law. The classical heritage lingered in medieval Europe. Kings and emperors could be zealous in enforcing God's law on their subjects, but they themselves, as time passed, began to see exemption from the law as a royal privilege. Others besides rulers laid claim to a like immunity. Both church and university saw their role as above men's judgment, and the doctrine of academic freedom, or freedom from accountability, is still with us. This was also basic to the concept of the divine right of kings. We see versions of this in the rationales of civil officials in their violations of God's law. When Otto Scott in James I wrote about the homosexuality of the monarch, one historian criticized him for not respecting, quote, the royal privilege, end quote. The most militant attack on the idea of law came from the Marquis de Sade, who held that, because he rejected God, he thereby had rejected all law. This was indeed a logical conclusion: no God, no law. To reject the one is to reject both. This, for Sade, meant the freedom to rob, rape, kill, bear false witness, practice incest, homosexuality, bestiality, and more. No God, no law. This was a logical conclusion for fallen man to take. Man's original sin, to be his own God, lawmaker and judge, Genesis 3:5, means that no overarching law order can exist. Man's self-will then becomes the only tenable law. With this premise, Ted Bundy's challenge to any and all laws banning the pursuit and rape murder of young women becomes tenable. The direction of anti-Christian culture is thus a suicidal, Sadean one. The answer to this has at times been a pragmatic one. Both Cicero and Voltaire wanted the, quote, common man, end quote, to hang on to some kind of faith to avoid social anarchy. Exemption from law would be the privilege of the elite. They would be, in effect, the new gods, safeguarded by the myth of morality and law which bound the peoples. But the gods who died for the Roman intellectuals were in time dead also for the, quote, common man, end quote, as well. The gap between the top and the bottom in any society is never as great as men imagine. Moreover, these intellectuals try to substitute an insanely invalid notion of order for the reality of creation. As Charles Norris Cochrane observed, quote, "It is precisely at this point that the idealist commits the crime of Prometheus in seeking to appropriate what belongs to Zeus, or, like Adam in the garden, eats of the forbidden fruit in order to become like God. In other words, what he does is to treat knowledge not as a means to wisdom, but as a source of power. This power to which he thus aspires proves, however, to be quite illusory, for what he has in fact accomplished is to substitute his notion of order for the order which exists in the universe, the fictitious for the actual, the dead concept for the living reality. His problem is thus to give currency to the counterfeit of cosmic order by persuading or compelling men to accept it as genuine. The effort to do so constitutes the history of politics in classical antiquity." End quote. It is revelatory of modern man's Kantian premises that he believes that his idea of order is thereby the actual order. He affirms with Hegel that his conception of reality is reality because he's a philosopher. Post-Kantian man sees himself as the creator because the knowable world is the construct of his mind. It lives because he and his kind of thinker live, and it can die with them. Now, because Kantian thinking sees man as the knower who creates the world and its order, it sees itself also as the executioner. The creator man must reorder reality as his rationalization requires. Thus, what he wants and needs are not laws, but regulations and controls. The amount of laws passed by the US Congress are few when compared to all the regulations and controls issued by the federal bureaucracy. However, even the ostensible laws passed by Congress are commonly regulations. One such quote-unquote law to further free trade, supposedly, the 2-volume index covered many hundreds of pages. It was said that no man had read the whole quote-unquote law, which was framed by many groups of quote-unquote experts and then put together. But this quote-unquote law then governed all Americans, none of whom had more than a minimal knowledge of it. God's law concerns offences against his order. Man's law attempts to create an imaginary order and becomes a form of disorder. Why law? Why God's law? Because there is a fundamental and given law order ordained and created by God to bless his people and his creation, and that order must not only be protected but advanced. This means that one order, God's, is true and all others are false. Tertullian at this point was ahead of others in the early church because he insisted that the choice was not between two truths, two sets of laws, or two commonwealths, but between right and wrong. Where the Roman state's view of order was concerned, quote, "We have no pressing inducement to take part in your public meetings, nor is there aught more entirely foreign to us than affairs of state. We acknowledge one all-embracing commonwealth, the world." End quote. For Tertullian, that world was God's, not Rome's, and God's law and word must prevail, not man's nor Rome's. To question God's law means to accept Bundy's question, why is killing a deer morally valid, but not killing any man or woman? To deny God is to answer that question, but not validly. Babies are now routinely aborted by the millions, but in some areas killing deer and even rattlesnakes is prescribed. If man sets the standards, there is no objective law nor morality which can protect man as against the rattlesnake. There is then no law, only controls and regulations.